Well, it's great to have you here tuning in today as we start our brand new series, our brand new summer series for January called How to Squander Your Potential, a study on the life of King Saul. We are in a brand new year. In fact, we're in day 3 of 2021. And who knows what this year will bring? As we enter into a brand new year, this year has so much potential for every single person. The potential to overcome, the potential to lose weight, the potential to learn to play an instrument, the potential to grow in your relationships with others, the potential to grow in your relationship with Jesus like no other time in your life, the potential to leave behind things from the past that have been thwarting your life for so long, the potential to become the person that you want to become, a person whose yes means yes and your no means no, a person of integrity rather than shallowness, the potential to receive a revelation that this year that you're going to follow Jesus like you've never followed him before and love his church like you have never have before. That in the year 2021, things like that are all going to change. Sounds exciting, right? Sounds great, right? But really, what is potential? How many times have we heard somebody say, wow, that person has a lot of potential. That person has great potential. Yet how much unrealized potential is there? Because when you think about it, potential is a zero. Potential has done nothing yet. Hasn't got any runs on the board, so to speak, as yet. All potential is really an opportunity for you to put the right things into practice to set yourself up where you'll reap the fruits of greater potential. So you may have potential. We all have potential. Somebody may have potential, but it does not mean that they will do anything with it. School teachers may understand that probably better than anybody. And as I said, today we're kicking off our new series for January, a 5-week series, and it's called How to Squander Your Potential. How to Squander Your Potential, looking at the life lessons and the story of King Saul. And we're going to study 1 Samuel throughout this series. How did Saul move from a humble man, a humble young man, to a vindictive and jealous king? Because we're going to discover that there were some habits, there were also some character traits, there were some blind spots, pride, that all stemmed from one major issue. It was the little things that actually grew into big things that led to Saul's demise. We may think that we are on the right path. We, like Saul, may think that we're the big hero. But just might our actions be leading us to squander our potential? So let's jump into 1 Samuel chapter 13 and discover a critical situation that King Saul is faced with. 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting at verse 5, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical, that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offering. So King Saul's reign marks the beginning of a new era in the history of Israel. from leadership that was based back in the book of Numbers, Judges, where religious leaders mainly served military functions in times of crisis, now transitioning now to leadership found in a king. They thought if we get a king to lead Israel, that's going to take care of all our problems. And you know that when the Israelites asked the prophet Samuel for a king, you know that this is not going to turn out so great. You know that there's going to be a rocky road ahead. And God, in fact, tells the prophet Samuel, he says, Samuel, hey, they're not rejecting you, Samuel, as a prophet. In fact, they're rejecting me as their leader. They're rejecting God. They're rejecting me as their king. And then God instructs Samuel to warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Don't you just love God so much? If you want free will, God will give you free will. God will give you, ultimately, at the end, God will give you what you want. If you want to do things your own way, like the nation of Israel, they wanted a king. God warned against it, but in the end, he relented and he gave them what they wanted. Because the truth is, God says, I'm not looking for robots. And he wants people who want to be in relationship with him and want to follow him and be obedient. He's not looking for robots, and the truth is he'll be the same with us in 2021. King Saul was all about himself. And a number of character traits began to emerge when things started to spiral out of control. And so in verses 5 to 9, we see that in the midst of battle with the Philistines at Gilgal, many of the Israelites are beginning to get afraid of this critical situation. And so they began to abandon the fight. They began to lose hope and trust in King Saul. And there's a bigger reason behind that, which we're going to look at a little bit later. But here is King Saul, and he's leading fearful, quaking troops, hiding in caves and trees and thickets. And here is the very first thing that you need to always do so to avoid squandering your potential in 2021. And the first thing is that don't take shortcuts. Don't take shortcuts. King Saul was told to wait for the prophet Samuel to come and offer up a burnt offering to God. He was told to wait 7 days. Now, King Saul hardly waited 7 days. He must have got up very early on that seventh day, because he barely waited the 7 days, and then he did something that so many Christians can do at times when they grow impatient and afraid. Saul took matters into his own hands. And so you may read this and think, wow, that's a bit harsh. I mean, at least Saul offered a burnt offering before the battle. But here's what you need to know, that King Saul knew very well himself, and that God had made very, very clear to the Israelites and to the Israelite nation. He made very clear about the role of kings, about the role of priests, and about the role of prophets. Unlike other nations, kings did not perform priestly duties. And God was saying, all right, I'll give you a king, but they are not prophets and they are certainly not priests. And history shows how dangerous it is to combine religious and civic authority, and God would not allow the kings of Israel to be priests and the priests to be kings. Saul took the situation into his own hands and he took a shortcut and never did what he knew that he should have done before God. Not only was Saul deliberately disobeying God, which was bad enough, but he panicked and he was fearful when he saw his troops, the men, deserting him, and he became fearful, and he didn't see Samuel coming. He was driven by the circumstances around him instead of faith in God to protect and to provide. How often do you take matters into your own hands? Instead of trusting God for that circumstance, Saul was impetuous rather than patient, only listening to his own advice, and in particular, never listening to the word of God. Do you take matters into your own hands when it comes to your finances? Do you take matters into your hands when it comes to decisions? Do you take matters into your own hands when it comes to relationships? Are you impetuous, rash, and reckless like King Saul, or patient? There have been numerous times over the last 23 years of pastoral ministry where I have sat with people in my office and where in some cases they have deliberately taken shortcuts when it comes to relationships, whether it's trying to find a boyfriend or a husband or a wife or a partner. And in many of those cases, I knew that God had a better plan. God had a better plan for them. But they took a shortcut. And they took matters into their own hands and settled for a relationship, a marriage that was not the best that God actually had in store for them. Now, obviously, God's grace is bigger than all of that, and God is sovereign over stuff like that. But don't allow fear and impatience to make you take shortcuts, to take matters into your own hands, because ultimately when a person does that, they don't trust God. They want to take control. They want to sort it out for themselves. And God says, okay, I'll let you do that because I've given you free will. You see, out of fear, out of panic, out of not knowing what else to do, Saul did something clearly sinful. King Saul took matters into his own hands because he didn't trust God, and he allowed fear to cause him to make a terrible decision. That's one way of squandering your potential in 2021. Let's keep reading. Well, just as he had finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. Saul replied, "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favour. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." We need to learn that God is more concerned with obedience than he is with sacrifice. God is more concerned with obedience than he is with sacrifice. Do you notice in those above verses how many times Saul says "I"? When I saw the men were scattering, I thought, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. I thought, I did, I had to do something to impress the people, to impress the troops, to gain back their support. You know what? You didn't come within the appointed days. You see, Samuel, it was really your fault. If you'd been here, then I wouldn't have done that. If you'd come earlier, I wouldn't have done this. I had to. It seemed like the right thing to do. I couldn't wait any longer. And the whole manner of Saul's explanation makes it clear this was no misunderstanding. He didn't say to Samuel, "Did I do anything wrong? Did I do something wrong?" He knew exactly what he did, and he probably thought of the excuses ahead of time. And we learn something else here about King Saul, and it was his belief that the sacrifice would secure the victory, not following God's command. In verse 13, Samuel says, "You have done a foolish thing. you have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. Now, I tell you what, if that's not thwarting your potential and your destiny, I don't know what is. There were clear consequences for Saul's decision to prioritize a ritual over God's command. See, really, ultimately, partial obedience is not really obedience at all, is it? How shocking it was to discover that if Saul had just been patient, if Saul hadn't have taken things into his own hands, if Saul had just done what God had asked him to do, what did God ask Saul to do? He had to wait for the prophet to come, wait for Samuel to come. And if Saul had waited, what did Samuel say God would have done? Established your kingdom over Israel for all time. See, don't ever think that the little things don't matter. Saul had a lack of spiritual sensibility, which was not from a lack of knowledge about God, but rather the wrong focus and a lack of attentiveness to the things that God cares about the most. Samuel says, Saul, it's not that you did the sacrifice and the burnt offering. It's that God told you to wait until I came and I would have taken care of it and led it and organised it. And then God would have led you into battle and would have brought about victory. Like, we shouldn't just obey God based on a circumstance. We should obey God in every circumstance. And Saul thought he was only just ticking off the ritual. 1 + 1 = 2. Just tick a box kind of thing, and it doesn't matter if Samuel's not here because at least the burnt offering gets done. You know, as long as I tick off the go to church box on a Sunday, as long as I throw a few dollars in the plate, that's all good. I mean, what do you want from me? I ticked the box and I fulfilled the ritual. See, Saul was thwarting his potential from day one because he displayed a knowledge of God without real faith in him. As a church, we often celebrate communion together. And with communion, there is a deep sense of connection and significance in the practice and we do it because Jesus commanded us to do it, similar to full immersion baptism. But if we separate the act from the specific command Jesus gave, we would actually be practicing it in ways that did not honour his heart behind the command. Like, big deal that you took communion today if you don't go home and love your neighbour or seek God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. Saul forgot that God desires obedience more than anything else. Saul was disobedient because he relied on his own strength to get things done. Saul had actually misplaced his faith. He placed his faith and trust in himself rather than in God. Saul was a man after Israel's heart. He was all about image and prestige and all the things that men look at. But now, God will give Israel a man after God's own heart and raise that man up to be the next king. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 22 says, Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. We need, if we want to guard against thwarting and undoing our potential and squandering our potential in 2021, finally, from this text today, we learned that we need to nip fear and doubt in the bud, we need to nip fear and doubt in the bud, or thwart your God-given potential. Squander your God-given potential. Saul's actions here at Gilgal were not the first time that he allowed fear and a lack of trust in God to be his downfall. Don't ever forget that the fears that you sweep under the carpet today will always find their way back out into the light. What fears you don't overcome, what doubts and insecurities you push away, will always resurface down the road as they did with King Saul. Let's jump forward to 1 Samuel chapter 17. You know the story well. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Eves and Dammon between Socoh and Azkar. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Some things never change, right? Give me a man. Goliath says, "Give me a man. Give me a man." I mean, the Israelites, why were they terrified? Why were they terrified? Because Saul never had modeled to them what it looks like to not be terrified. Never modeled to them what real leadership looks like. Here was King Saul, procrastinating as usual, not trusting God for the victory. And what does Saul do? He procrastinates for 40 days. 40 days. 40 days. While the armies of God are being defiled. Every morning, Goliath would step forward and hurl insults towards God and Israel. What would allow a king or a leader to do such a thing? Unless he was full of chronic fear. Listen, you will never get anything done for God that is of real eternal substance whilst you're still sitting in the locker room full of fear and doubt in yourself. You'll never step out of faith into a job or volunteer ministry role or anything else until you've slayed fear. In verse 12 it says, "Now David was the son of an Ephraite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah." Here comes, and here is King Saul's replacement. And we're going to learn about what happens over the coming weeks with King Saul and David. You see, it took a courageous young man who had experience fighting the lion and the bear, who knew that the same God who saved him from the jaws of the lion and the bear will be the same God who will help him slay this Philistine giant. David, the shepherd boy, had more an understanding of facing and overcoming fears than the king of Israel. Go figure. And we know what the outcome was for Goliath. Lying dead on the ground without his head. Final question for you. Who should have been the one who went out to face Goliath? Really? King Saul. You've seen the movie Troy, right? You know, with Brad Pitt and Eric Bana. In the ancients, that's what happened, when the king or the best fighter goes out to fight the battle one-on-one. That's what Saul should have been doing. That's where Saul should have been. But no. It took a young shepherd boy. Why? Well, back in 1 Samuel 13, Saul sowed fear. Saul sowed doubt, and he had a lack of trust in God. Saul sowed, and throughout the rest of 1 Samuel, he reaped. The seed for Saul's lack of leadership and character are sowed back in Gilgal. Do you know, in 2021, if you would like to reach your God-given potential in all areas of life, then you must learn that it requires active trust in God in face of fear or doubt, and to evaluate your habits and your character and discover if you are practicing your faith in God or finding comfort in other things. I really pray that you will join us throughout this summer series called How to Squander Your Potential as we look at King Saul. I know there's going to be so much great content and application for my life and also your life as we head into 2021. God bless. Thanks for being with us today.